Hello everyone, welcome to Buttocks Across Britain, wrestling in the 19th century. You're all obviously wondering what I mean by buttocks across Britain. A buttock is a wrestling throw. If you ever read Lorna Doone, the hero Jan Red, he makes it clear very much from the start that he's a wrestler. And it's mentioned all the way through the books. And one of the first things he does is he said, the good men of Devon, if they met with the Doones, they would be a match for the villainous Doones. They would be a match for the Doones in a wrestling ring with a buttock. And if you don't know that terminology, you might not necessarily get what he means, but what it is, it's a wrestling throw. It's a hip throw. So you stand as if you're in a waltzing position, and you turn inwards, put your hip or your buttocks into the stomach or the lower regions of the other person, and you flip them over your hip. So this is actually what it means, and it's quite common in a lot of the 19th century literature that some of the writers throw in wrestling terminology to spice it up a little bit, which if you don't know the wrestling terminology, it makes it all the more exotic. So tonight I'm going to be talking about some of the history about mainly traditional British wrestling, but I'm also going to look at some international things which influence the later scene in what we now know as wrestling. Before this, I'll just do a little bit of history on top of that. And if we look at the picture here, we've got three types of wrestling. In the left, this is Cumberland and Westmorland wrestling from northwest England. This is one of the remaining traditional styles. There's only really three remaining traditional styles in the British Isles. As you can see, they're dressed in the leggings and the trunks, or the centerpiece as it's called, and they're outside, and all this wrestling happens outside. So this is from the later part of the 19th century. In the bottom left, this is actually Turkish wrestling, oiled wrestling. They'll wear leather trousers, they'll coat themselves in oil, and they do something that looks a bit like Olympic wrestling, or for the Americans, like your folk style wrestling, the college wrestling that you get. And the one here, I'm not quite sure, to be honest. It looks like it's Swiss, because they've got these shorts on, and the shorts going over the leggings, these are actually to hold on to. And it stresses the fact that there are different kinds of wrestling. A lot of people think wrestling is this homogenous sport, and it's not. For example, Cumbrian wrestling, there's nothing happens on the ground. You throw someone, the first part of their body, other than their feet, that touches the ground, they are finished. With the Turkish wrestling, you can go onto the ground, you can get them in different holds on the ground. Both the Olympic styles, which we'll mention later on, both the Olympic styles involve ground wrestling. Traditional British styles generally don't, except in Lancashire, which is a very strange thing. Okay, so let's jump on a little bit. Unfortunately, I didn't get time to edit because of my computer problems, but the picture here is from Cumbrian wrestling, or Cumberland and Westmorland wrestling. This is around the Lake District, for those of you who don't know the kind of British geography. And as you can see there at the bottom, there's also running as well. And Cumbrian wrestling, Cumberland and Westmorland wrestling, is one of what we call the lakeland sports. So like fell running, running up a mountain, running down a mountain, wrestling, jumping. And as I say, it's one of the oldest sports in Britain, and it's the one that still remains. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the early years of wrestling in Britain as it appears in literature. Now, wrestling is really found in most countries or most cultures throughout the world. What we have here, we've got Beowulf. Beowulf wrestles with Grendel. He also rips his arm off, which is not part of real kind of modern wrestling. And so this is one of the earliest accounts that we have in literature, in British literature. Wrestling also appears in ancient Greek literature. There's wrestling at the funerals of Achilles in the Iliad. In the center here, this is more from the Renaissance period, and you can see here they're lifting each other up, they're tripping each other, and these things are very similar to what you'll see now. On the right-hand side, this is from forgotten the name now. Shakespeare.
As You Like It.
Thank you. Yeah, this is from As You Like It, with Charles the wrestler being soundly defeated. The interesting thing, if you read that play, and you'll find that Charles is the champion of the Duke, and this was very much something that appears through European history about there being a wrestling champion paid, like a paid athlete, to take on all comers. And we'll see a little bit of that later on. From medieval point of view, Chaucer's Miller is noted as being a wrestler. He says, loud, stocky and broad-shouldered, he would boast he could heave any door off hinge or post, and he could go and win the ram at any wrestling show. And down below, we've got some wood carvings, which are from, one is from Ludlow in Shropshire, which again, it's on the Welsh border, for those of you who don't know. And it's from the Church of St. Lawrence. And this is I think a 15th century wood carving. And we can see there the prizes. So there's a belt there, there's a wool sack that they might win. Perhaps they might win a horse. The other one is from Nantwich, which is in Cheshire, just above Shropshire. And it's interesting that the carvings we have of wrestling in English churches tends to be down the west side of the country for some reason. Most of them are down from kind of Lancashire, Cheshire, and down along the border. And as we can see there, they seem to be holding on to a belt. And it's a little bit like this Swiss style that I just showed you. They're wearing shorts, they're holding on to the belt. And you don't find this anywhere in Britain now. Probably the nearest place you'd find it would be Iceland, where they wear a special harness. And again, that's a very old style, but it doesn't really exist anymore. It certainly doesn't exist in Britain. The problem is with a lot of the older texts, they don't actually say how they wrestled. So we can assume they had some kind of system like the traditional styles that we still have, or they may have had something totally different, using a harness, going to the ground. We don't really know. They don't tell us these things. Presumably, I'll take a guess, because a lot of people knew what it was, so they never had to explain it. Now, here we have the Cotswold Games. They started in the 17th century, around 1610, and they're still going in some version. I think they've been resurrected a few times. And we can see different sports there. There's running with the hounds, there's acrobatics, and just, I'm pointing at the screen here that nobody's going to see. And just below, on the right-hand side, you have the two gentlemen with what look like swords. Just below that, you have two wrestlers. And if you go to the Cotswold Games today, they have something called purring, which is derived from this style of wrestling. It's shin kicking. And in the old days, they had hardened shoes, and they basically kicked the living daylights out of each other's shins as part of the wrestling. Then you could throw them down. These days, I think they can just wear boots. They can't wear wooden clogs or anything. But so that there's a long history of the practice of the wrestling. Organized sports, these are actually known as the Cotswold Olympics, even back about the 17th century. So this also ties into something else with the Olympic movement. Another gentleman was a man called Sir Thomas Parkyn, again 17th century, and he was a lord of a place called Bunny, up around Nottinghamshire, and he wrote one of the first books about wrestling, and he illustrates it saying it's a self-defense and it's a great sport. And the book is called The In-Play or The Hugg Wrestler. Now, the first time I heard this, I thought it was something to do with pubs, you know, the in-play, and the Hugg Wrestler. I thought, well, what's that? And actually, he explains it in the book that he very much favoured the Cornish style of wrestling. And the Cornish style of wrestling, it's a stand-up style, and you hold kind of the lapel or the shoulder and the arm, and it looks a little bit like judo when you're standing up. So there's tripping, there's throwing. And the reason it's called the in wrestler isn't to do with the pub. It's because you're getting close to wrestle. And he stresses this point that the Yorkshire and the Cornish and the West Country wrestlers wrestled in very close. Compared to the people on the east of England, like the southeast, who had a wider stance, they were further out, and they favoured more long tripping, a bit like we see here in the Cotswold Games. And we'll see later with the Cornish wrestling how this is a lot closer. This is where the Hugg wrestling comes in. And Sir Thomas Parkyn, he was a big enthusiast. You can see the drawings from the book here, showing some of the different techniques and also how to get rid of an unwanted rowdy guest at dinner time. This is in the middle and the top here. So different ways of getting rid of your unwanted guests. He was famous for organizing wrestling tournaments in Bunny, and the prizes would be things like gloves, a hat. He used to take part in himself, being a gentleman, and I think he stopped when he was winning a bit too many, so he allowed people to carry on. And the prizes weren't generally money. They were things like a nice pair of moleskin trousers or something like this. And he's buried in the church at Bunny. I think it's the Church of St. Mary, but I stand to be corrected there. And as you can see there, he seems to be almost in a wrestling pose. Okay, so although Mr. Parkyn was doing Cornish wrestling, it was up in Nottinghamshire, again in the North Midlands. And it really stresses the fact that wrestling was all around the country, but now it only really exists in 2-3 places if we include Scotland. In England, there's only really 2 places that there's still a tradition. And the biggest tradition probably is Cumberland and Westmorland wrestling. The wrestling is probably older than the name, to be honest. If you go to Northumberland, this is the style they wrestle in Northumberland, but they call it Cumberland wrestling. It also used to take place down in Lancashire, just down from the Lake District. And until fairly recently, there was a kind of, I'll say healthy, there was an active group of wrestlers. The name probably came up from the early 19th century, partly because of a book, which we'll look at in a moment, partly because of journalists. The railways started going up through this area, and the Lake District, of course, became a tourist place, thanks to people like Wordsworth and some of the other Lakeland poets. And of course, one of the things that they saw was these traditional sports, like the fell running and the wrestling. So it was around this period people started talking about the Cumberland style or the Westmorland style of wrestling. And so now, no matter where it's practiced, this is still what it's called. So, as I say, even in Northumberland, they still talk about Cumberland Westmorland wrestling. If we look at the gentlemen, we have a man here, George Stedman, the one without the moustache, with the white hair, and he was the world champion for some years from a young man. He finally retired because nobody could beat him. Now, one of the things was, at that time, there was no weight categories. And as you can see from Mr. Stedman, he was a big guy. And the way of doing this Cumbrian wrestling, you put your left hand over the right arm, and then your right arm under the opponent's left arm, and you hold like this, halfway up the back or between the shoulders, and then you try to trip them or throw them, but you have to keep that hold. If you don't keep that hold, you lose. If you touch the ground without with another part of your body than your feet, you lose. So you can pull someone onto the legs, you can trip them onto the back. Obviously, if you go down with them, then you have to land on top of them, because if they twist at the last minute, they get the fall. And the style really hasn't changed since this period. Maybe some technicalities like how high you hold them. Now, until 1860, the wrestlers could wear what they wanted. They could just turn up, strip to the waist, turn up in, ripped old work clothes. And around this period, there was, obviously with the tourism coming up and things like this, there was a bigger move to kind of clean up the sport a bit, if you like. And it was decided that wrestlers had to wear a uniform. Now, if you think about the strong man in the circus, with his trunks and his tights, this is similar sort of costume. But why just have a boring old similar looking uniform? If you have a look at the trunks of the gentleman with the moustache, you'll notice he's got some embroidery on his trunks. And a tradition sprang up of having embroidered trunks and embroidered tights. The trunks are often made of velvet. A few years ago, they actually banned people wearing Bermuda shorts, but the trunks would be made of velvet. Could be purple, could be black, could be green, and often beautifully embroidered. If we look at the picture at the bottom, you'll see the gentleman with his hands on his hips, the 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth one in from the left. He's embroidered on the front of his trunks, as is the gentleman on the end. And even I think this, yeah, I think if you look at this chap with the hands on his hips, he's got embroidery all up the legs and across his shoulders. And what they're possibly doing here is the lineup before the wrestling, where they would be inspected, and the best dressed wrestler would get a prize. And it this still happens. You go there and there's all these, like, you know, young lads and older lads, and they're all puffing their chests out. They're all wearing this kind of gear, and a little grandmother comes up and looks at the embroidery and checks the embroidery, and oh, that's nice. Nice little flowers and birds and things like this. So this tradition began in about 1860. Oh, there's a doggy. Oh, it's a cat. It began around this period, and it developed, and now it's just established as a tradition. But it comes back from 1860s, around that period. The Cumbrian wrestling, as I said, the name really probably got popular from a book called Wrestliana, written by a man called William Litt. Now, William Litt was an associate when he was younger of Wordsworth. I think he worked for his father or something like this. But there was really quite a difference, because you know, Wordsworth was this sort of very, you know, art and romantic and things, and Litt was a wrestler. He was from a fairly wealthy family, obviously not too wealthy, but he spent a lot of his time hanging out with the wrestlers, learning how to wrestle, and he was quite a successful competitor in the late 18th century, early 19th century. And in 1822, I think it was, he wrote the book Wrestliana, historical account of ancient and modern wrestling, and it's considered the first history in English of wrestling. Parkyn's book was more an analysis of the wrestling style, and Litt's book talks about wrestling in literature. He talks about Chaucer. Interestingly enough, when he talks about Chaucer, he doesn't mention the wrestler, the miller. He mentions Gamelin, who is basically the same story as You Like It. And he mentions Gamelin. Now, why would he do that? Why doesn't he mention the wrestler? Probably because he's trying to put across the fact that wrestling is this dignified sport. And both he and Parkyn both stress in their books the good things about wrestling, the healthiness of it, the alert mind, the fact that you can't be a drunkard if you're a wrestler, because you won't be a good wrestler. Parkyn actually has quite a funny section in his book where he says young wrestlers should avoid the wrestling schools of Burton-on-Trent because they're very bad for your legs. And Burton-on-Trent is a brewery town, so it was obviously where there was a lot of drinking going on. And Litt's book is noted as being the first history, and he goes into the history of Cumberland wrestling, about who some of the old stars were, who some of the up and coming ones are. And he also lays down an idea of codified rules, which weren't as codified before he laid them down. After he'd finished wrestling, he had a mixed career. He was a bit of a journalist. He tried running a brewery, and failed. And he hightailed it off to North America, and he ended up being a teacher, and he died there, never to come back to Cumberland. I think it's his great grandson is the novelist Toby Litt, and Toby Litt has actually explored about this, about the life of William Litt, and confusingly also called his book Wrestliana. But it's a very interesting book, talking about the kind of different ideas of masculinity, as say from Wordsworth's point of view, being this artistic poet, and Litt's point of view being obviously a very physical, macho guy. And again, if we look on this side, we can see the picture we saw earlier. Some of the holds there. This man in the dark. You have the gentleman with the bell, and you have the two men to the right. It looks like the one man is trying to lift the other up so he can throw him, and the other one's got his leg wrapped around him to stop him. And then they fall over at some point. If they both fall at the same time on the side, it's known as a dog fall, and it's neutral. It's a no contest, and they would start again. If we look at the two gentlemen either side of the wrestlers, in the gentleman with the bell, and then if we look, we have the one man with the flag on the far left, and the man just below the bell, he's got an hourglass. And the hourglass wasn't to time the rounds. It was to time how long it took them to take a proper hold. Because as you see them there, they're starting to take the hold. And if you're not feeling comfortable, you can shrug your hands, you can break your hold, you can start again, and you could be penalized if you were taking too long, if you were delaying. So they would stand there with the hourglass, timing how long it was taking them to take the hold, so they weren't wasting time. The other gentleman's got a flag, and he'll put the flag up when there's a clean fall, like the referee. Okay. Now, moving on with this Wordsworth connection, also from Litt, Scotland has its own traditions, and a lot of historians actually suggest that Cumberland wrestling was taken to Scotland. Personally, I'm not sure about that, because I think it is really just a border style. I don't have any historical documentation to prove this, but I find it very hard to believe that it was only in Cumbria. I find it very hard to believe it wasn't something that was regularly practiced over the border. The gentleman on the bottom left is a man called, he's known as Christopher North, and he was a That's his pen name. He was a well-known writer, and he was the editor of a journal in Scotland, of whom one of the star writers was James Hogg, Justified Sinner, Confessions of a Justified Sinner. Now, your man North here, he was very active in the Lake District. He knew Wordsworth and all these people, and somewhere Hogg met with Wordsworth, and he spent some time down in the Lake District, and this was where Hogg got this name of the Ettrick Shepherd. He was a shepherd. He was a poet, a writer, a singer, a song collector, and he did a lot of cooperation with this gentleman on the far right, who is Sir Walter Scott, who wrote all these stories about the Highlands and kind of reintroduced the idea of the kilt and the tartan. But that's another story. Now, Hogg actually includes wrestling in some of his works. And going back to this thing that Lit was talking about the classical nature of wrestling, and he traces it back through all the gentlemen and the heroes, and takes it back to ancient Greek mythology. And in some of the works of Hogg, Queen Hind, his kind of epic poem about the Scottish and the Vikings meeting, and also in the Bridal of Polmood, which is a kind of medieval melodrama type story. He uses wrestling in this very classical way. They have these big tournaments to decide who will marry the princess, or who will win the battle. Rather than have a battle, let's put the two champions there. Similar kind of thing is actually done by Scott in some of his works. But where Hogg really has his wrestling moment is in the lives of George Cochran. And the stories of George Cochran are supposedly semi-autobiographical, and they were very scurrilous at the time. You know, people actually, I think it was censored a little bit. Basically, it's a young man who, if he's got a different, you know, if he's got like a different girl every week, and it follows all these love adventures of him trying to court another girl here and there. And there's a classic moment in the second half where he wants to court this young lady, but her father insists whoever is going to court her has to wrestle first, either him or another challenger. And somebody tells George about this in the tavern, and offers to practice with him there and then. So he wrestles this guy, beats him, and then he goes on the courting, and there's another courter there. So the two of them actually have to wrestle, and George wins, but various things happen that his love adventures come to naught. It's actually a very, very funny story, much funnier than I've made it sound, and quite a nice kind of bedroom farce for a lot of it. Now, why is this sort of important? He mentions a special trip. He says, I caught him with this really fast trip, and he mentions it 2 or 3 times. And William Litt, when he wrote his book, he said, I've read the stories of George Cochran. I don't actually understand what it is about this trip that's supposed to be so good. He says it must be something, and he theorizes what kind of throw it is, but we still don't know. But years later, George Cochrane was written in 1820. A few years later, in 1827, Hogg, with some help from Scott, he founded the St. Ronan Games in Scotland, doing traditional sports like archery, running, throwing, and also wrestling. And apparently he wasn't actually very good at archery or things like this, but there are accounts of young men saying how Mr. Hogg showed them this trick and wrestled with some of the younger guys, showing them this wonderful trick that he did. Again, we still don't know what it is, and maybe the young guys were letting him do it, but he was obviously very, very into his wrestling, obviously had a background in it, and being a shepherd and a farm labourer, he was quite a big guy. So this is very much the Scottish connection. We don't really know what style they were doing at the time, but the style that they did in the Ronan Games, the St. Ronan Games, was the same as this Cumbrian style. In Scotland today, they call it backhold because you hold on the back. So some historians have suggested that Hogg might have brought the tradition from Cumbria into Scotland. But again, I'm personally a bit unsure about that. Okay. The other place where traditional wrestling still really exists, although dwindling very much, is the West Country. If we look at the picture at the top here, this is Cornish wrestling from, I think it was about 1910, this picture. And in the bottom, you can see, if any of you watch Poldark, the TV series based on the books, this is the Cornish wrestling scene from this, where the young preacher wrestles the brutish gamekeeper. And interestingly enough, that scene in Poldark actually puts a nod to one or two traditions or one or two stories within Cornish wrestling of there being preacher wrestlers. Some preachers didn't like it, but there were a case of some preacher wrestlers who had no problem getting in the ring. Now, what's different between the Cornish style and the Cumberland style? One, it's not a fixed hold. So they don't hold like this. You can see they've got special jackets on, and these are reinforced canvas jackets. And so they can hold the shoulder, the sleeve, the lapel, and they can use this for throwing. Again, nothing happens once they hit the floor. It's very much connected with wrestling from Brittany called Guren. And the languages are very similar. I believe they're mutually understandable between Cornish and Breton. And for a long time, up until I think the early 19th century, there were matches and visits between the Cornish and the Bretons that really kind of faded out with the Napoleonic Wars, because they obviously couldn't go over to France. And also around that time, the Cornish language pretty much died out. There is some debate about whether it ever really died out. Maybe it kept going under the radar. But around that period, they stopped going to Brittany so much. The language declined. Also amongst that period, if you watch something like Poldark, late 18th, early 19th century, lot of poverty and unemployment in the Cornwall area, and a lot of the miners moved. A lot of them, as a lot of the people involved in it were involved in the Cornish mining trade, the tin mines and things like this. And there's a historian of wrestling, appropriately enough, called Michael Tripp, and he wrote his doctoral thesis on the history there. And a lot of these guys went across Britain, and they took the wrestling with them. So you would find Cornish wrestling in London, around Staffordshire and Shropshire, where there were mines. There was big Cornish wrestling there. And probably more importantly, they took it abroad. And they went to Australia, South Africa. A few years ago, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, somebody actually found an antique champion belt from the champion Cornish wrestler of South Africa. So the tradition actually continued around the world. Now, what it also did was it got to America. And here it kind of changed and developed a bit. America, there's certain states which are very renowned for their wrestling. And they trace it back to something called collar and elbow wrestling. So you'd take hold here and you'd take hold here. And some of the histories that you'll see will say that it came from Ireland, but there's also reference to it in Tom Brown's School Days, the novel Tom Brown's School Days. Tom's mentor when he's a young boy, the old man who looks after him, is known as a champion competitor of the elbow and collar style, and goes over to Cornwall and over to Devon and the West Country to indulge in the wrestling there. And this comes back to what Parkyn was going on about how the Cornish and the people around sort of, Sussex, East Anglia, all these areas, had a similar kind of wrestling style. That doesn't really exist in that part of England anymore now. So when it got to America, it was being practiced by farmers, by miners, people like this. And eventually it changed, it morphed. Somewhere it developed a ground wrestling style as well. And it got very popular across the US. And in 1905, the Americans actually introduced wrestling into the education system. So you get this collegiate wrestling in the high schools and what they call folk style wrestling in the sort of junior high schools and the middle schools. And I think now it's about 50, I think 49 out of 50 states sanction it. Whereas in Britain, there's absolutely nothing comparable. Never has been. As Michael can tell you, probably more likely you were going to learn boxing in school. Okay, so here we've got our Cornish wrestlers. Now, I'd like you to look carefully at this. I think the caption at the bottom says Devon and Cornwall wrestling. I can't see it, unfortunately. And we can see they've got these canvas jackets. Quite probably these were jackets that you use for work. They're just extra strong. Now they've developed into a particular style of jacket. You can pull it up around the neck. You can see where he's got the hold, very different to the Cumbrian. Take a look at this one. Make a few notes. And have a look at this one. Ooh, this is Devonshire wrestling. So the throw's similar, but does anyone notice something particularly different? Let's go back. Ooh. Have a good look. particularly towards the bottom of the picture. Now have a look, particularly towards the top of the picture. Nobody guessed. Oh, of course, you're all muted.
Tracy called it, I think, shoes.
Yeah, the Devonshire wrestlers wore shoes. Not ordinary shoes. The toes of the shoes were usually soaked in bull's blood or calf's blood and then baked, and they were rock hard. And the major difference between Cornish and Devonshire wrestling was that you could kick the living daylights out of the other guy's shins. Now, the Cornish wrestled barefoot or in stockings, and they considered this really a kind of, you know, a bit of a loutish thing to do. And yet there were inter-style matches, Devon and Cornwall. And what would happen was the Devonshire wrestler would wear one shoe. So it really was a kind of blend of the two styles. Now, the other thing, if you look at the legs of the man who's still got his feet on the floor, you can see that the shins were actually bound up with some padding. And, they're bound up with some padding because you were allowed to put some kind of protection on your leg. And this is, as I say, it's a bit similar to this purring that you get in the Cotswold games. But this is actually one of the reasons, or two of the reasons, that Devonshire wrestling died out. There are accounts of wrestlers in books in the 19th century, but they stress the fact that it was dying out. And by about 1920, it had gone, possibly even before that. Cornish wrestling is not too far behind it at the moment, actually. And one of the reasons was it took too long. When they were getting ready for a match and they're binding up their legs, it actually took too long. So there were less matches going. Whereas if you were doing the Cornish style, you could have more wrestlers. Cornish wrestling also began to decline again. Mike Tripp's written a paper about this. Corruption within the sport, and some of the wrestlers were fixing the matches because a lot of the money came from gambling, huge gambling. Look at the amount of people all around the audience there, all around the wrestling ring. There was a lot of money involved in it. William Litt, who wrote Wrestliana, he also wrote a novel called Henry and Mary. Wasn't a big success, and it's a bit of a strain to read, but the first part of the book, he talks very much about the gambling situation and about how sometimes the wrestlers would agree maybe not to wrestle, and that way they would both get a split of the prize. There was one case in Devon where, or Devon or Cornwall, where the man agreed with his partner, agreed with the opponent not to wrestle. So the opponent got all the money, and while he's waiting to get his share, the opponent jumped on the train and got out of there, and this guy was left with no money. So it was happening quite a lot around this period, and so people began to lose interest. Also around this period, boxing began to get very popular. Boxing, with the Queensberry rules and things like this, boxing began to pick up a lot of the fans of wrestling. In 18 if I remember correctly, 1864 in Shropshire, at Shrewsbury, one of the National Olympics. They offered a silver medal for wrestling in Shrewsbury, and nobody turned up to compete for it. They all turned up for the boxing. So boxing was beginning to take away a lot of the interest of wrestling, possibly why wrestling really died out in England. Okay, now here, this is a picture, I think it's Thomas Rowlandson, if I remember correctly. Picture of some Cornish wrestlers. And Thomas Rowlandson, if I remember correctly, London artist, came over, did some nice pictures of the West Country. He also did a picture here of an auction of a wife in the West Country. Now, let's have a think. Auction of a wife. Two men wrestling, one of them with his hand behind his back. Does this ring a bell to anyone, I wonder? Mayor of Casterbridge by some Thomas Hardy. The main protagonist, as we know, offers his young rival a wrestling match, or he doesn't offer him, he forces him into it. And to show how fair he's being, he ties one hand behind his back to show he's a really noble character and he's giving this other guy a chance. No, he wasn't. If we have a look at this one, this is an actual technique of Cornish wrestling, which was quite common until the later part of the 19th century. And Hardy knew about it. He'd done some research. I mean, he was from the West Country. He'd probably seen wrestlers anyway. I find it hard to believe he didn't. But he'd also done some research into wrestling at the period. And he'd found at least one account of a championship wrestling match where the one wrestler wrestled entirely with one arm, probably to humiliate the other wrestler, but also it's an actual tactic of keeping your one arm back so that the other person can't get a hold. And then at the right moment, like this chap on the right, he can move in to get a hold. So when Hardy writes in the Mayor of Casterbridge that, you know, guy's got his arm tied behind his back and he's being so noble, it's rubbish. Hardy knew it was rubbish. If we look at another picture here, and I think this is I think this is a man called Abraham Can. I could be wrong, but they're doing the same thing. They're wrestling with one arm. And my sister used to be a judo competitor, not in the early 19th century, but she's not that old. But she said there's also a tactic in judo where you do it. Because when I told her about the Mayor of Casterbridge, she went, "Oh yeah, we used to do that. There's a whole style of wrestling based around it." So this tactic apparently was quite popular till the late 19th century, according to some wrestling historians. But West Country wrestling became very popular in literature. If you look at Lorna Doone, you know, Lorna Doone, the hero of Lorna Doone, Jan Ridd, he's a wrestler, and he makes it clear from the start. And he, excuse me, I just need to get something here. Yeah. R.D. Blackmore, who wrote it, he grew up in kind of Dorset and Devon, around that area, and probably learnt a bit about wrestling as a young boy. And he's very fond of wrestling. And you find it in at least 3 of his books. In his book, Pearly Cross, there's a whole section about a champion wrestling bout between the champion of Cornwall, who turns up and he's, oh, damn Devon, Cornwall forever. And he's walking around with the belts and nobody's going to challenge him. And then this voice comes over and says, Cornwall be damned. And it's actually the guy who's classed as the villain, a man called Harvey Tremlett. All the way through the book, you find he's cast as a villain, as a blackguard. And then he stands forward for the honor of Devon and he beats the Cornish wrestler. And after that, you find out he's actually a very nice guy. He's a very honorable guy. And Blackmore obviously liked wrestling, and he liked his wrestlers. In his books, he makes them the heroes. So Jan Rid, he's fighting with Carver Doon, and Carver Doon, this epitome of evil, shoot a man in the back, this fearsome bandit. He can never beat Jan Rid when Jan Rid is wrestling. One of the first times they meet, Jan puts him on the floor, bang, straight away. Jan's a big guy. He's a champion wrestler, wrestles for Devon against the Cornish champion. And again, there's this scene where he wrestles the Cornish champion for the belt. Clara Vaughan, another book. Again, there's a whole chapter on this wrestling style. And what's interesting with these championships, as I said, we had the Devonshire and the Cornwall wrestlers wrestling together. For things like the West Country belt, the Cornish belt, the Devonshire belt, and also a lot of money. There are ballads about some of these wrestling bouts, and Blackmore was obviously basing some of his stories on these huge wrestling bouts. And one of the most famous is Abraham Can versus James Polkinghorne. Can is the man on the left. Polkinghorne is the man on the right. Abraham Can, born 1794, died 1864. So not a bad age, I suppose. James Polkinghorne, 1788, died 1851. And they were both pretty big men. I think I think they were both somewhere around the region of 6 foot. And Polkinghorne was the champion of Cornwall, and Can was the champion of Devon. And on the 23rd of October, 1826, they met. And reputedly, there was something like 10,000 people watching. Which, if we look back at, that picture there, we can see that there was obviously some interest in it. But Polkinghorne and Can, this was the, Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua. This was the Fraser Ali West Country wrestling bout. And they were going to get £200 each in 1826, which was quite a bit of money. I haven't done the conversion. And that would there would probably be a certain amount of extras, if they were betting. And the match went on for several falls. I think it was the best of 3 falls was arranged, or it was a time limit. I'm not quite sure. Polkinghorne threw Can. He then threw him a second time, but it was disputed, and it had to go to the judges. And then there were several more throws, one way or another, and then Polkinghorne threw Can another time, and again it was disputed. and eventually it was called a draw. So if you ask a Cornishman who won, of course, he will say Parkyn. If you ask in Devon, they'll say Cam. And there's actually a plaque now on the wall of the inn near where they wrestled. They never wrestled again, although they do seem to have become a bit friendly, and they were referees at some later matches. Interesting thing about the referees, you had gentlemen who used to walk around the ring with sticks, making sure that you were obeying the rules. And they were called sticklers because they were sticklers for the rules. So this is possibly where one of the earlier uses of stickler as a kind of referee with a stick is still in use in Cornish wrestling. Okay, as I say, there's ballads about these guys and other champion wrestlers around England. There's several broadsheet ballads still around. As we can see here, 1909, Padstow in Cornwall, there's a wrestling match, a silver cup and £100 prize. And some prizes for the rest. So you do still get Cornish wrestling, but it's very, very small these days. You can still find pictures of it on the internet. I'd like to move over to France now. The reason I'm moving over to France is in the early 19th century, a French style developed. And if you look at the pictures here, what you might notice is they're not tripping each other. They don't trip each other and they don't hold each other's legs. The bottom section of the drawing on the right is supposed to be jiu-jitsu, but it might also be guren. But Greco-Roman, they called it Greco-Roman or classical style. Possibly started from wrestling styles in the Mediterranean, south of France, but they don't use leg trips. They don't really use their legs for anything. Everything's upper body. And it became known as the French style. And it became very popular worldwide. Funnily enough, not so much in Britain. And it's chosen, by the end of the 19th century, it's chosen as one of the Olympic styles. It has ground techniques, but again, you don't grab the legs. The other Olympic style is something called freestyle, which is related to something called catch wrestling, where you can basically grab whichever bit you can get hold of. French style got very popular. Catch wrestling. So you can see some holds there. This is, I think, from about the 1920s, this picture. It just shows the style a bit easier. And there was a style called catch as catch can, which developed in Lancashire, again in northwest England, very much in the mining towns and the factory towns. Very hard style of wrestling. Groundwork, and basically catch as catch can. Grab any part of them that you can grab. The man on the right is a man called Billy Riley, who later on the 20th century, he started a very famous catch as catch can club in Lancashire and attracted people from all around the world. It's called the Snake Pit. This style and the French style became very international. And this began to lead to what we think of now as professional wrestling, like the World Wrestling Federation, things like this. And this started back very much in Europe, in France, and also in America. Big exhibition bouts, usually catch wrestling or French style. So in this case, what we've got of two of the biggest guys from America, a man called William Muldoon, the one on the right, born 1881. And the other guy, Clarence Whistler, 1856 to 1885. He died very young, but they were both experts in this French style, the Greco-Roman style. And they had similar rivalry as Polkinghorne and Cam, except they toured around America doing the matches. But they had one big challenge match in 1881, and it lasted 2 hours. And, you know, that's like without breaks. You know, they might have short break, but basically it was 2 hours. And I've seen guys in the Balkans wrestle for over an hour and had to be stopped. So I can well believe that this was the case. And there was a big rivalry between them. There was a woman involved, of course. And Muldoon actually complained to the referee that Whistler had got ammonia in his hair. He got long nails so he could scratch and grab, but he got ammonia in his hair. So when they got close, it was burning Muldoon's eyes. But it didn't really work because Muldoon won. Whistler then spent the rest of his time slagging him off. 2 years later, they met again, and this time Muldoon threw Whistler at the ground, and he broke his collarbone. And they kind of made friends over that, actually. Whistler then later was invited to Australia by a man called Professor Miller, and he beat Miller. Miller was a big champion, but then he went on a big bender drinking and died from the effects, either the alcohol or the weather. So he died pretty young. He was only about 29. Muldoon carried on with a gym, a fitness center, physical culture, very popular. Again, toured different places. And he also trained John L. Sullivan, the famous boxer. So boxing and wrestling seem very much together. So this is the basis of what we now call professional wrestling. And there were a lot of big international superstars. The man on the left here is a guy called Yusuf Ismail. He was the first guy to be known as the Terrible Turk. And he actually won this big oil wrestling contest, like I showed you at the beginning, in Turkey. And he then toured Europe, and he was phenomenally successful. He was beating a lot of the top names. He went to America, beat some of the top names over there. And then he was going home, and he was going to start a coffee house with his winnings. But the ship was shipwrecked, and accounts were that he had a money belt around his waist, and he had so much silver in it that it pulled him under, and he was drowned coming home. So poor Yusuf. So that was 1898. He was born 1857, died 1898. The man with the moustache and the folded arms. This is Professor Miller from Australia, big noted physical culture and wrestling. Amongst some of the people who wrestled was this guy on the top right-hand corner, a man called Donald Dinnie, Scottish strongman and wrestler. A lot of these people were both strongmen and wrestlers. And again, Dinnie used to travel the world, and I mean the world, doing exhibitions. He went to Australia. He fought Miller once, and I think he broke his leg. He broke Miller's leg, and they called it a no contest. And then in the next one, Miller won by some questionable judging. If you think you've seen Donald Dinnie before, you're probably right. This is him on the bottle of the Bar's Iron Brew, this famous soft drink from Scotland. There's another wrestler there. This is Dinnie on the right with all his medals. And Dinnie was wrestling quite late in life. He knew several styles. A lot of these wrestlers knew several styles, so they could compete in different competitions. And the other thing with Dinny was that eventually he was denied a performance license because he used to wrestle in the music halls. And a lot of these guys did tours wrestling in theatres, music halls. He was denied a license, even though he could still lift more than some of the younger people. He died in 1916, but he was really popular amongst his fellow physical culture people, and they had benefit nights for him. The man below him is an Indian wrestler called the Great Gama. The Great Gama was from what would now be Pakistan, and he really started wrestling at the end of the 19th century. The early 20th century, he beat everybody, really obliterated the top names. Phenomenal wrestler. One of the men he beat was this gentleman next to him, a man called George Hackenschmidt from Estonia, known as the Russian Lion. Hackenschmidt spent most of his life most of his wrestling life in England, and again he toured. He toured around. He was managed by the famous impresario C.B. Cochran, who was a music hall impresario. And Hackenschmidt, again, he was one of the top elite wrestlers. But Gama took him out in a few minutes. The one man he didn't immediately beat was this man on the side, Stanisław Zbyszko, or also known as Zbyszko Cyganiewicz. Polish wrestler, again, spent a lot of time in Britain and also America. And these guys were moving around between France, America, Australia, Britain, all through the later half of the 19th century into the early 20th. Cyganiewicz met the Great Gama, and he forced a draw. Basically, he didn't let him turn him over onto his shoulder, but he spent most of his time underneath him. The next time they met, Gama destroyed him as well. But Zbyszko, again, was one of the top wrestlers. He was wrestling guys like Dinny, Hackenschmidt. And these were the basis very much of this professional wrestling we see now. Why? Because some of the bouts were so long. Some of these bouts were 4 hours long, maybe even longer, 6 hours. And so someone like Hackenschmidt, his wrestling technique wasn't necessarily dynamic. It was effective. And he was told by some of the theatre people to learn some entertainment skills. So these elements of entertaining started coming in to the wrestling as well. And then by the 1920s, that had really picked up. Also, with the decline of wrestling because of the gambling situation and the match throwing, people would go to wrestling matches to be entertained rather than to think who was really going to win. So, and as well as that, a lot of this grew out of the circus. So Zbyszko he began his career in the circus. He takes the name Zbyszko from a famous knight in a novel called Knights of the Cross, or the Krzyżacy. And this was his heroic name. Okay, so we looked at the Bars Iron Brew. As we see here, 1899, a wrestling tournament in, I think it's in Yorkshire, possibly. And we've got wrestling. Looks like catch as catch can by the look of it. And wrestling by ladies. The first time on record. Ladies wrestling, as we'll see in a little bit, it was very much more like the professional wrestling, like a spectacle. Not that they weren't necessarily great wrestlers. You've got some here where they're showing some moves, they're showing some techniques there. I did have these ladies' names, but I've put them somewhere and I don't know where they are. Okay. This was a European championship in, I think it was about 1898, 1901, somewhere around that. And you got here the Bennett sisters. They were boxers and wrestlers. Ladies boxing was actually quite a thing as well. And as you can see there, it's a lot more, a bit more glamorous. So ladies wrestling tends to be very much connected with professional wrestling. Until we come to this little thing, Bartitsu. Now, someone asked me earlier on, they said, oh, that must be Japanese. Not so much. Bartitsu was really the first MMA, the first mixed martial art, at least in Europe. The gentleman with the self-defensive moustache in the center there, if his fists don't get you, his moustache will. A man called Edward William Barton Wright. He was an inventor, and he spent some time in Japan. And when he was in Japan, he learned jiu-jitsu and judo. Judo at the time was still called Kano Jiu-Jitsu, after Chigoro Kano, who devised it. And when he came back to Britain about 1898, he got masters of European styles like French kickboxing, cane fencing from, I think, Switzerland, various types of boxing and wrestling, and he taught them in a club in London for about 2 years. And one of the things was he also taught women. And if we look at the picture up here, we've got some of the moves a woman can do with jiu-jitsu. So, you know, the traditional wrestling is now beginning to make way for Asian wrestling and things like this. If you think now that there's only something like about 40 or 50 wrestling clubs through Britain, and there's about 40 wrestling clubs in London, judo clubs in London alone, it'll give you an idea of how much Asian martial arts have really taken over. The other thing that Barton Wright did, he brought two of the first judo instructors. Again, they were jiu-jitsu instructors, but and these are these gentlemen here. Sadakuzo Uyeniski, I think, was one of them. They stayed with Barton Wright for 2 years, and then they started, when the Bartitsu Club, it's named after Barton, it's like Barton Jiu-Jitsu, Bartitsu. When the Bartitsu Club closed, they started the, I think it's the Golden Square Judo Club, one of the oldest judo clubs in Europe. And this was where some of the first women judo players in Britain and Europe learned their skills. So as you can see there, we've got, you know, cane fighting, how to fight with a jacket, a bit of boxing, jiu-jitsu as a husband tamer. You know, if your husband complains about your cooking, all the things you can do to him. Now, what happens? 1906, we're moving out of the 19th century, but 1898, 1899, some women start training at the Bartitsu Club. They later start training at the Judo Club. One of them was a lady called Emily Diana Watts. She's the lady on the left, and possibly the lady on the right. I'm not quite sure. And she was, I think, one of the first female black belts in Europe. Judo was kind of unique in some ways in that it never stopped women taking part. And she was one of the first black belts and first judo instructors in Europe of a non-Japanese, European and female. So quite a lady. Born 1872, died 1971. So it obviously kept her fit. Another lady who possibly is the one in the picture there, I haven't seen a picture of this lady really, was a lady called Edith Garand. Edith Garand's husband was a wrestler. He joined the Bartitsu Club, as did she. She joined the Golden Square, trained with Emily Diana Watts, and later she trained the bodyguard for the Pankhursts and the top suffragettes. And this became kind of colloquially known as suffragitsu. And you can see the 1910 cartoon in the middle there, all the policemen hanging on the railings. In fact, even if you look at those pictures, the lady is taking out a policeman. So these women were actually trained in jiu-jitsu. So if you see this kids film, this Enola Holmes, and you see all the suffragettes learning jiu-jitsu, it's real. Maybe not the way they show it, but some of the moves that they do that look a bit fancy, they actually have in their training manual. And of course, Holmes, what happened? I saw the footprints and you had disappeared. Well, Watson, as you will know, I am skilled in the Japanese wrestling called Baritsu. What he wasn't skilled in was spelling it properly. And the return of Sherlock Holmes, he mentions this Baritsu. And it was years later, somebody put the key together that Conan Doyle and Barton Wright actually occasionally wrote for the same magazine and possibly worked in the same building. So Conan Doyle probably knew about the Bartitsu Club and just misspelled it. Or I mean, maybe he didn't put Bartitsu because he knew maybe it was an in joke. But this was where apparently Sherlock Holmes learned his stick fighting, his Japanese wrestling. And even today, there's been a revival of the Bartitsu. You can buy books on it and go to workshops, and they sell it as the martial art of Sherlock Holmes. Okay, so one thing I was going to mention was that by the end of the 19th century, the Olympic Games had started. There'd been National Olympics in England, starting a place called Much Wenlock in Shropshire. And the funny thing is, Much Wenlock in Shropshire, there's a list of over 50 disciplines for the first Olympics. Wrestling isn't on it for some reason. It became part of the National Olympics. But as I said, by the end of the 20th century, it was really dying out. Boxing was taking its place as a more popular sport. The Olympics chose Greco-Roman wrestling, the French wrestling, under the idea that it was related to the ancient Greek and Roman wrestling, because the holds look very similar to the ones you see on the old vases. A few years later, they did catch wrestling or freestyle wrestling. So these are the two international styles now. Women's wrestling was not allowed in the Olympics until about 1998, I think. Women's judo didn't get into the Olympics till 20 years after men's judo. And women's boxing was outlawed by the British Amateur Boxing Association for 119 years. So we shall finish with the ladies, give them their due, and thank you very much.